everybody, welcome to Cheeseology with Adam, the cheesiest channel on YouTube. I'm Adam. Today we're going to be making a cheddar cheese. This is going to be a little bit different than the other cheeses we've made because cheddar cheese, you're actually using a process called cheddaring. That's why it's called cheddar cheese. That involves increasing the pH of the curd after we get done cooking the curd to between 5.2 and 5.3. But we'll get to all that here shortly. First, we'll go through your list of equipment and ingredients, and then we'll go from there. So some equipment we'll need for this cheese is a stock pot, a heat source, 3 gallons of milk. I just used vitamin D whole milk from the store for this. It's pasteurized milk, so we'll be adding some calcium chloride. I'm going to be using a pH meter for this cheese. If you don't have that, that's fine. Just use the time frames that I'm explaining during this process and it should be fine. I want to monitor the pH. The cheddaring process is the process of actually increasing the acidity down to about 5.2 to 5.3 during the processing of the cheese. We'll also need a medium hard cheese form, curd knife, thermometer, draining cloth, and then I'm going to be using, instead of this colander I have right here, I'm going to be using 2 tubs that you might have seen in other videos that I use. There's a reason for that, but once we get to the cheddaring process, I'll explain all of that. So what we're going to do first is pour our milk in. We're going to add our calcium chloride. Then we're also, for this cheddar cheese, we're going to use annatto, which is a natural food coloring. It's been used for hundreds of years in cheeses. Any red cheeses that you see are slightly red. That food coloring is annatto. We're going to use animal rennet. I use animal rennet for my cheeses to separate the curd from the whey. It's going to coagulate the curd. And then the culture we're going to use is C101 bacteria culture. All the ingredients I just mentioned can actually be purchased from the link in the description of this video. So we're going to get started with adding our milk, calcium chloride, and annatto, and then we're going to raise the temperature up to 86 degrees. Again, remember, everything must be clean and also sanitized. I use food grade sanitizer in a spray bottle mixed with water. So I just give my equipment a shot as I start the process, and that's perfectly fine. Our milk is now in the pot, 3 gallons. For every gallon, if you're using pasteurized milk, for every gallon you want to use a 1/4 teaspoon of calcium chloride. So I'm going to add 3/4 teaspoon to this pot, and then we'll mix it around. I'm going to give my stir just a spray of sanitizer. I'm going to mix this up and down movements. We don't want to just stir the top. We actually want to stir, go up and down so the calcium chloride gets mixed in. Just do this for 10 seconds, 20 seconds, somewhere around there. And then the fun part, we're going to put in our annatto here in just a moment. Now, for 3 gallons of milk, I'm going to go for a little bit of a darker cheddar, just because I feel like doing that. So I'm going to put a teaspoon of annatto in. If you want a little bit lighter, use a 1/2 teaspoon. It's really at your preference. It's not going to hurt it by putting more in, and just make it darker. So I'm going to put a teaspoon in to our 3 gallons of milk. Okay, and use those up and down motions. Now what you're going to notice is it may not be as dark as you're looking for, but as the cheese ages, it will darken. You'll see that through the process of aging. Okay, I'm going to put on my heat. We're going to raise this to 86 degrees, and then we will put in our culture, the C101. I'm going to put our thermometer in. We're going to sanitize it first. Okay, I'm just going to put this to the side. I like to put the lid on it. You're not going to get it fully on because it's a thermometer, but I like to put it on partially just to keep dust out, things like that. Okay, well that's heating up. Every so often, as I mentioned in other videos, we want to stir this up and down, slow motions. From here on in, any stirring that we're doing is going to be very gentle. We don't want to be splashing the milk. It's a gentle process. So what the purpose of stirring it while it's heating up is we don't want the milk to get too warm on the bottom and be colder up top. We want it to consistently get warm to 86 degrees through all of the milk at once. Our milk has gotten 86 degrees. Now we're going to take it off the heat so it doesn't continue warming. And what we can do now is add our C101 Culture. Sprinkle it all along the top. We want to give that about a minute or so to rehydrate, and then we want to stir it in thoroughly. Just like we're doing with the other stirs, we want to do gentle up and down motions. Make sure it's thoroughly mixed in. And then once we mix that in, we're going to take our thermometer out, put our lid back on, and we want to try to maintain this heat, 86 degrees, for 90 minutes. You can wrap it with a towel, drape it with a towel, try to insulate it in some way, just to try to keep it as close to 86 degrees as possible. So I'm going to now stir this a little bit, and what we're doing is we're acidifying our milk at this point with this culture. This bacteria culture, what it'll do is it will consume the lactose, the milk sugar, and convert it into lactic acid. The lactic acid is what's giving us our acidity. Alright, I've stirred this in pretty good. As I said, I'm going to take the thermometer out, I'm going to put our lid on, and then we're going to wrap it with something, and we'll be back in 90 minutes. Okay, it's been 90 minutes. What we want to do now is take our lid off, add our rennet. What I did was I added 3/4 of a teaspoon to about a half cup of non-chlorinated water. This is just to dilute it a little bit. We're just going to pour this in. Now we want to stir this for about a minute or two. Up and down motions, real nice and slow. Or gentle, I should say. The milk already smells like cheese. At least I think so. This is at the point where I first get that cheese smell in this process. And I love that. We want to make sure this rennet is mixed in good. This is what enables the curd to separate from the whey. We're going to put this lid back on. We're going to put our towel back around, and we're going to let this sit for a full 45 minutes. At that point, we'll cut the curd. It's now been 45 minutes since we put the rennet in and let our curd firm up. So we take the lid off. I can see already it looks pretty firm. I'm just going to make a small slice and kind of twist my curd knife a little bit. If there's a clean separation, then our curd's ready to cut. How we want to cut this is vertical strips about a 1/2 inch wide, and then horizontal slits kind of on an angle, or else you'll end up with strips straight up and down. I'm going to kind of cut it on an angle so you get 1/2 inch squares. So let me see if it's ready first. Perfect. So I'm going to make my vertical slices. Okay, now I'm going to make my horizontal slices kind of on an angle. Now that we've cut the curd, we want to let it rest for about 5 minutes so the curd sides can heal a little bit. Once 5 minutes has gone past, then we're going to bring it back up to temperature. If it's dropped from 86 degrees, and then after that, we're going to cook the curd. My curd has only dropped about 3 degrees, which is great. So I am going to put it back on the heat source and just bring it back up to 86 degrees over about 10 minutes. I'm going to bring it up slowly, and we want to do a very slow stir on this. We do not want to shatter the curds, break them up. Right now they're still very moist, so they can break up very easy. As they dry out a little bit, they'll keep their shape a little bit better. And if you're using pasteurized milk curds don't hold as well as raw milk. But just do it very slowly, and you'll be fine. Now that we're back up to temperature, we're going to keep our heat on, and we want to raise this temperature of the curd and whey to 102 degrees. This should take about a half an hour. Just a few degrees every 5 minutes, and this is cooking the curd. So what we're doing in this step is actually taking the moisture out of the curd by heating it up and a little bit of slow stirring as we do this. We want to get the whey, some of the whey out of the curd. If the curd is too moist, when we press it and age it, you're going to have what's called a weeping cheese. It'll expel whey during the aging process, and you'll have continued acid production. It'll be a bitter, wet cheese, and it will not be what you want. As you cook the curds, if you pause from stirring, you're going to see that they start dropping below the surface of the whey. They're not floating as much, they're not as buoyant. The reason for that is because they're losing moisture. As we cook the curds to 102 degrees, you should experience this. And then once we get to 102 degrees, we're going to remove the pot from the heat source, and then we're going to continue to stir very, very slowly for anywhere between 30 minutes and 60 minutes. It just depends on how big your curd is, how dry they are at that point. If you see your curds are breaking up, even though you're stirring very slowly, with pasteurized milk this will happen, or at least happens to me. You don't have to continuously stir. You can do intermittent stirring. What we don't want is, for this cheese, we definitely want to dry these curds out. But we don't want it too dry to the point where there's too much moisture lost, or else it won't press properly. As we're cooking the curd, getting it up to 102 degrees, you want to make sure that you take your stir all the way down to the bottom of the pot. As soon as the curd starts to settle, it starts to meld together. This is an example right here of a clump that I just pulled off the bottom. And you're going to want to break this up with your stir. You want to keep the curd about a half inch wide pieces to 3/4 of an inch. Just make sure you use your stir on the bottom of the pot. You'll see what I mean as it starts to dry out and sink. When it starts to dry out, it sinks very fast, and that's when it actually starts sticking together as a mass in the bottom of your vessel. We're at 102 degrees now. You want to keep it at that, or at least no more than that. And I'm going to take the pot off the heat source, or if you're using a gas stove, just kill the gas. I take it off because my hot pad will continue to heat this up, and I don't want that. I want to keep it at 102. Now, what we're going to do, that we've reached this temperature, is we're going to slowly stir this for 30 to 60 minutes, just depending on the moisture of the curd. We'll do this until the curd is at the proper moisture. One way we can do this is, I won't do it now because it's certainly not ready yet, but shortly I'll show you. I'll put some curd in my hand and I'll smush it together, and I'll open my hand, and if I can take my thumb and push on it and it breaks apart pretty easily, not staying smashed together. If it breaks apart pretty easily, then your curd's at the moisture you want. So we'll continue to stir this 30 to 60 minutes, and then we will remove some whey, and then we'll start the draining and cheddaring process. Okay, I've been stirring for about 40 minutes now. After I reached 102 degrees, I took it off the heat source, and I kept stirring intermittently, slowly, because I'm using pasteurized milk, and as you'll see in a moment, how much the curd is really broke up from the initial half-inch slices. As I mentioned before, if our curd is done cooking, we should be able to take a small handful, kind of smush it together pretty firmly, and then take our thumb, and if it breaks apart pretty easy, then it's good. That breaks apart really nice. I think we're good. I'm going to stop stirring there and we'll start the next step. As you just saw, the curd is at a good dryness for our next step. So what we'll do is we'll start draining and then cheddaring. For our next step, what we're going to do is skim off some of the whey. We're going to remove enough whey to where there's only about an inch or two of whey over the curds, and then we'll start with the draining. I mentioned earlier we'll be using a colander, but I switched that up. What we're actually going to do, because we're cheddaring this, and you'll see what I mean a little bit later, is I have two pans here, about 6 inches high. One I have holes drilled in it around the edge, and then this one is no holes. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a draining cloth, cheesecloth, lay it in here. I'm going to put this one in the pan with no holes. The reason for that is once we get our whey down to about an inch or two above the curd, we're going to dump that in. We want the whey to still be covering the curd. I'm just skimming off the whey. You're going to notice that most of the curd has settled all to the bottom. There'll be a few pieces floating on top, but that's okay. We just want to keep on removing it until we start seeing curd and we have about an inch or two of whey on top of the curd still. Shouldn't need to take too much more off. I can see the curd. All right, I have my sanitized cheesecloth. The spray bottle that I use, I just have a bucket of that, and I just dip the cheesecloth in and then wring it out. So now it's sanitized in case there's anything on there. And I just lay it. Again, I'm laying this in the tray that has holes in it. So I'm going to do that, and then I'll put this tray in the tray with no holes. So I'm going to do this right here at the table. I don't need to take it over to the sink, so I think it'll be okay. I just want to get everything in here. And the goal is here to get all the curd in and still have some whey covering the curd. I could have used some more whey, but that's okay. We'll pat it down, keep it in there. Now that we have the curd and the whey into this pan, we just want to make sure there's no big clumps stuck together. I'm going to kind of stir it up. Make sure it's kind of uniform. You can see the whey, but I would have liked to have a little bit more, but that's okay. We're going to be draining it here in a minute anyway. The purpose here is to try to keep it warm, but I think we'll be okay. I have this room that I'm in pretty warm, specifically for that reason, so it doesn't get too cold as we process this. And then in a couple minutes, we'll drain it, and then we'll start cheddaring. I'll go over that process. What we're going to do now is we're going to drain all the whey. So we're going to fold your draining cloth over, and then I'm going to take this over to my sink, drain it, and then I'll bring it back. Once we have the curd drained, we're going to keep the cheesecloth folded over, and every about 15 minutes, for the next 2 to 3 hours, we want to flip that whole thing. What we're doing is letting the acid continue to develop. This is the cheddaring process. I'm going to take you through each step as we go. So what I'm doing at this point, you can see I dumped the whey out of the pans, and I just have this folded up, my cheesecloth, and I'm just letting it drain a little bit before I put it back in the pan and fold the cloth back over. So just trying to get some more of the whey out, but this is what it should look like at this point. So as you can see, I've put that cheesecloth that I had in my hand back in the pan, and I still have the two pans. I want the pan with the holes on top so the whey can drain, and then in 15 minutes I'll come back and I'll flip this, and we want to do it about every 15 minutes or so for the next 2 to 3 hours. It's been about 15 minutes since I first put the curd back in the pan with the cheesecloth folded over. Now what we're going to do is flip this over. We're going to keep it covered with the cheesecloth. Try to keep it warm. We're going to keep turning this about every 15 minutes. You're going to see from that first flip how it's consolidated already. We are going to break this up and press it, but this is the cheddaring process. We're letting the acid build up, and we're also letting the whey drain from the curd. So I'll come back, flip this again in about another 15 minutes. Okay, another 15 minutes has gone by. We're going to flip it back. Continue to keep this warm and flip it every 15 to 30 minutes for the next 2 more hours. But what we're trying to do during this time is let the acid still develop. We want an acidity of about 5.2 to 5.3 before we start pressing. We'll start pressing about 5.4, but let's just see where we're at now, and then it'll give us an idea of what else we have, how much time we have left. about 5.74, 73. So we still have a little while to go. So I'm just going to cover this back up, try to keep this warm, let the acid continue to develop until about 5.4, and then we'll have the appropriate acid level that we want, and then we will start pressing. This right here, folks, is the cheddaring process. Letting the bacteria continue to eat that, to work on that lactose and create lactic acid. It's been about an hour and a half since we first started the cheddaring process. I'm going to flip this again. I'm going to take another pH reading and see where we're at. We're looking for about 5.4 before we actually start milling the curd and then putting it into a form. Okay, we're at about 5.67. So it's still dropping, so that's good. Again, we want it to be about 5.4. So I'm just going to kind of bundle this up a little bit again. Again, the acid development depends on the temperature, so we want to keep this, try to keep this warm. I just flip this over, I can feel it's still pretty warm on the bottom, now on the top, so that's excellent. We'll let this go for about another half hour, we'll test the pH and flip again if we need to, but really once we get to 5.4, then that's when we're going to mill it, basically tear it apart into pieces, and then salt it, about 1 ounce of salt, and then we'll press it. All right, it's been about 3 hours. I'm going to take a pH reading and see if we're at 5.4 or somewhere around there. If we are, then we can start milling and pressing. I'm just using a pH meter with a kind of a pointy probe. It's for putting into food. I'm at 5.38. That's perfect. 5.37 it just went to. What we're going to do now is we're going to mill this, tear it into pieces about the size of your thumbnail, maybe a little bit bigger, and then we're going to salt it. For a 3-pound batch, we want to use about 1 ounce of salt. We'll mix that in real good, let it absorb, and then we'll start pressing. So the reason we're going to mix salt into this after we tear it apart or mill it is because if we did brining or surface salted, it wouldn't stop the bacteria from continuing to produce lactic acid. What we're doing now is we're at the pH we want. Now we want to stop any further acid production. So that's why we're going to mix it in with the curd. So now I'm using non-iodized salt. I'm going to measure out 1 ounce for this 3-pound batch. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to mill the curd. So I'm basically just going to tear it into pieces about the size of my thumb, or maybe a walnut. Should be pretty large chunks, and then we'll salt. You'll see it's going to tear apart. That's perfectly normal. It'll feel pretty dry at this point. The reason it's kind of tearing is the protein structure has changed in the cheese, similar to what happens when you stretch mozzarella. It's pretty dry. It's to be expected. You're going to want to make sure you use the appropriate amount of weight to press, and I'll go over that here in a minute once we get to that step. If it doesn't consolidate, you want to put a little bit more weight on. You should have a good consolidated wheel of cheese after pressing when you're completely done. I'm going to salt it. I'm going to do this it'll probably be at least two iterations of this. You don't want to just dump it all in at once. Dump a little bit in, get it mixed up. The purpose of this again is to stop the bacteria from continuing to create lactic acid. If you find any big pieces as you're mixing this together, perfectly fine. You gotta break those up a little bit. You don't want it really, really tiny, but about, like I said, thumb to walnut size. Okay, now put the rest of the salt in, and we'll do a final mix. Now what we're gonna do is we're gonna get our cheese press down. I use a Dutch style cheese press. I've been looking at my other video on how to use that if you don't know how. I'm going to set that up, and then we're going to start pressing for 1 hour at 20 pounds, and then we'll flip it. We'll do an hour at another 20 pounds, and then we'll flip it again, move it up to 40, and then we'll do it at 24 hours at about 50 to 75 pounds. But I'll walk you through each one of those. I'm going to get my cheese press, get set up, and we'll go from there. Okay, what I'm going to do now is I'm going to put our cheese curd into our sanitized form. I'm using a medium-sized hard pressed cheese. So I'm going to bunch this up like this. Put it in, stuff it in there, and we'll get it evened out once we get it in. So, okay. So it's in the form now. I'm going to open this up. I'm going to make sure that the cheesecloth isn't like folded over, preventing the cheese to, preventing the curd to lay flat or anything. I just kind of pull it up a little bit, get any excess out, excess cloth, and push it down a little bit. Okay, I think we're good. I'm going to fold this over once, like that, and then we're going to put our follower in. Okay. Now I use a little piece of pipe because this piece is slightly smaller than the follower. Not enough to go in, but I don't want it to turn sideways or anything. So all I'm going to do is put this form underneath this press here. So to make sure it's straight. And we're going to hang our weight. And we'll do 10 pounds. Okay, we want to have this pressed for about an hour. Then we'll flip it, and then we'll press it for another hour at the same weight, and then it'll condense more, and then we'll flip it again and press at a higher weight. All right, we've pressed for 1 hour, 20 pounds. Now what I'm going to do is take the weight off, take the form out, I'm going to flip the cheese, rewrap it, put it back in the form, and we're going to press for another hour at the same weight, 20 pounds. You'll see whey slowly draining off this into the drain pan, and I just put this over my sink. You do this right in your kitchen sink. Now this won't be tightly consolidated yet. It's going to take a couple flips and more weight, but it'll definitely have started consolidating. So let's see how it looks. Oh yeah, good. Oh, that's looking perfect. Perfect, perfect, perfect. So you can see how it's consolidating pretty good. It's exactly what we want. Put this back in. Slide down into the form. And as like before, just to make sure there's no extra fabric down there, I just lightly pull up a little bit. Okay. Now we're just going to, like before, we're just going to fold over one side and put our follower in. So we flipped it, unwrapped it, rewrapped it on the other side, and now we put our follower back in. If you have extra cheesecloth here, you can just lightly tuck that in here so it's not laying in the way when it drains. You don't want to jam it in there and restrict the follower from moving, but I like to just get it up so it's not so it's not wicking up the whey that's coming off. So what we've done, we've unbandaged it, rewrapped it, put the same amount of weight on, 20 pounds, so it's 2 5-gallon jugs, making 10 pounds, and by hanging it here, I'm putting 20 pounds of pressure. Watch my other video on how to use a Dutch style cheese press. I'll explain what I'm doing, but we're in good shape right now. The first rewrap went well, it looks good. By the time we're done pressing, we'll have a nice consolidated wheel of cheddar. All right, another hour has gone past. What we're going to do now is I'm going to take the weight off, I'm going to take the cheese out, I'm going to flip it, rebandage it, and then we're going to press it at 40 pounds for an hour. And you'll see when you take it out, it will be more consolidated. Each time we flip it, it's going to be more consolidated. That still has lots of areas in it that need to be pressed, but we're just getting started with the weight. We're going down 20 pounds on each side. Now we're going to double that. All right, we're going to let this press for 2 hours at 40 pounds of pressure, and then we're going to take it out, flip it, and increase the weight and let it press overnight. The last press will be about 24 hours. I'll probably switch that about 12 hours in, so right now it's about 7:30 at night. I'll flip it tomorrow morning, with the increased weight. All right, now we finished pressing our cheddar. We did an hour at 20 pounds, and then we took it out of the form, flipped it, and then rewrapped it, and then did another hour at 20 pounds. And then we did 4 hours at 40 pounds. We took the cheese out of the form, rewrapped it, and then pressed it for 4 hours at 40 pounds. And then after 4 hours, we want to press it for 24 hours at between 50 and 75 pounds. You'll want to flip it at least once in between that. Why I say between 50 and 75, it really depends on how your curd actually comes together and how it presses. If you take it out of the press, the first couple times you take it out of the press, you'll still see pits and holes because it hasn't consolidated fully yet. When you get to the end of pressing, after 24 hours, if you don't have the well-consolidated cheese, then you want to add a little bit more weight and press it longer. If you can't get those curds to actually consolidate and form a smooth surface on the wheel of cheese, then your curd is too dried out. Next time, try to leave a little bit more moisture in the curd. You can cut them a little bit bigger. A couple different techniques to do that. But the end result here after pressing is you want a nice consolidated wheel of cheese. So I've finished pressing. We're going to see what I came up with. And as you can see, beautiful 3-pound wheel of cheddar. I'm going to let this air dry just a little bit, maybe a day at the most. I don't want it to get too dry because due to the dryness of the curds, it'll start to crack if we let it get too dry. You can wax this, you can do the traditional bandage, which I don't typically do, or what I'm going to do is I'm going to vacuum seal this and I'm going to age this for 6 months. You can really eat this at 3, but I like a sharper cheddar cheese. The longer you age, the sharper it's going to get. So I think I can probably make it to 6 months before I cut this. So that's what I'm going to do. Thanks for watching. I hope you learned something, and please like and subscribe.